Ben Hall was born down near Maitland in 1837. His parents arrived as convicts. Benjamin Hall Sr. from England, his mother Eliza Summers from Ireland. And both those people had very checkered pasts. But they would meet here in the colony and get married. Now Eliza Summers already had a child, Thomas Wade, Ben Hall's half-brother, but eventually they would settle in Marindy. Now, old Ben, in the middle of the 1840s, will decide to come out here to the Lachlan and try his hand, and he brings 3 of his children. But by 1850, he's decided to return to Marindy to be with Eliza, and he leaves 2 of the children behind. That'll be Ben Hall Jr. and his brother William. Now by then, they're accomplished horsemen and accomplished stockmen, and even young Ben was said to have been able to tell the condition of an animal just simply by looking at it, and he would draft it out, and that made them well sought after in the district. But it was on a property not far from Sandy Creek here where young Ben would come up a horse while trying to break it, and in coming off that horse he breaks his leg. Now in those days this was the middle of nowhere. There was no doctors within Cooee, so the locals would just set it the best they could, but unfortunately would leave young Ben with a permanent limp. But Ben was an ambitious man, and he's going to do something that was very, very hard to do. He wanted to climb above his station as a Catholic and a son of a convict. Ben Hall wanted to become a landowner. The story about Ben Hall, the Bushranger, starts right here. In 1855, Ben Hall will come and work at Weago Station for a guy by the name of John Walsh. And that fireplace and chimney behind me is the remains of the old Weago homestead. It's an iconic place in Australian and New South Wales bushranging history because men like Frank Gardner and John Gilbert and John O'Malley stood right at that fireplace. And what they were talking about and what they were contemplating, Lord only knows. But also, importantly, Ben Hall stood where I'm standing, on this very ground, because this is where Ben Hall will fall in love with John Walsh's middle daughter, Bridget. Now they're courting for about a year, and in 1856 they take the plunge, take a 2-day ride to Bathurst where they'll be married in the Catholic Church. Alongside them will be John Maguire and Bridget's eldest sister Ellen. And if you look at their marriage certificate, John Maguire and Ellen can read and write because they signed their name with a signature, but Ben and Bridget can't. Unfortunately, they can't read and write, and as you notice, their marriage certificate is simply marked with an X. But they all come back here to Weago and they'll work alongside the Walshes for about 5 years. Now, Weago's homestead was a 4-room building, rather large building for its time. It also had an out kitchen and laundry, but it also had 5 or 6 huts built around here. And in those huts would have been the Maguires and the Halls. Now, Ben Hall and Bridget, according to John Maguire, shortly after their marriage have a child, but unfortunately that child doesn't survive. Now we think there's no registered birth of this child, so we think it was probably stillborn and buried here at the Weago homestead. Now the reason we think that is that the Butlers have lived here since that time, and Peter Butler told us that when he was a small boy there were still 9 grave mounds still obvious on top of that ridge. So we're guessing that one of Ben Hall's children may be very well buried there. But 1859, Ben and Bridget will have another child, a boy by the name of Henry. And then Henry does survive, but unfortunately he never marries and never has any children. But they continue working here, John and Ben and the rest of the family. But John Maguire and Ben Hall are very ambitious young men, and in the 5 years they've saved up a princely sum of £11 and have eyed off Sandy Creek Station, the adjoining property to the northwest. And by 1860, they lay down the deposit and they're going to become landowners. Ben Hall's homestead. Where did Ben Hall live? Nobody can agree yet. Now we're going to throw our ideas into the mix as well. We know that Ben Hall and his brother-in-law John Maguire will take tenure on Sandy Creek Station in March of 1860, and that's shown in the Lands Department records. Now we pulled up the map of Sandy Creek, and you can see there is a portion A and a portion B with an agreed dividing line between them. In John Maguire's memoirs, he says that they combined efforts to take over Sandy Creek, but they will then run it as separable portions, and that makes sense, portion A and portion B. But who owned what portion? John Maguire is arrested as being on suspicion as part of the Elmgar robbery, and he's sitting in jail in Sydney, and he gets into financial trouble trying to pay his legal fees. So he sells his portion to the publican in Forbes, a guy by the name of John Wilson. Look down here at the 40-acre block that's coloured in that pinky colour. John Wilson's name's on that 40-acre block. So we made the conclusion that portion A was run and owned by John Maguire. Logically, portion B was Ben Hall. Now there's another block, a similar sort of colour, a 130-acre block. Now on the original version, you can't see it on screen, in pencil very faintly is tank and yards, and you can see there's a small dam sketched in there. So that concluded to us that this is possibly the site where Ben Hall had his homestead, and that dam had its origins in Ben Hall's day. This is the 40 acres, and this is where John Maguire lived. And this is about the location he had his hut. Now if you look at that survey plan that was done in the late 1860s, there was a dam on that survey plan. It shows the hut about here, and the 40 acres went from down that side, just behind the dam, along the back of the dam, along the edge of that cropping area and tree line, then up behind that ridge where they had the stockyards, and then behind the ridge behind us. So this was a 40-acre plot that John Maguire would live on, and this is where he had his hut. Now you have to think to yourself, it was a pretty brave move by Maguire and Hall to take on this block of land. You see, John Maguire's only got one eye. He lost it in a fishing accident in his teens, and Ben Hall's got a pretty nasty limp, which he got from falling off a horse and breaking his leg when he was in his teens as well. But they're here, and they've got to clear this land, and the way they did it in those days is they'd ring bark the trees, and when they died, they'd rip them out of the ground. But they're given a hand by Thomas Wade, Ben Hall's half-brother, and his brother William and his wife. And they come and live here with Maguire and Hall, and they help them build these homesteads, put in these dams, put in the stockyards, and clear this area. But in the middle of 1861, things are not going so well, because Ben Hall and John Maguire are out mustering cattle. And they've been out there for a little while, and they're running low on grub, and John Maguire says, I'm going to go back to the homestead and get some more food. And when he gets here, he's met by Ellen. She says, John, I've got some bad news. I think Bridget's run off. Now this is the middle of 1861. So John Maguire and Ellen get on a horse and go to Ben Hall's place. So it's not here, it's not next door, it's not anywhere nearby. They've got to go somewhere. When they get there, sure enough, Bridget's missing, Henry's missing, the side saddle's missing, and she's run off with a guy by the name of James Taylor. Now James Taylor is an ex-policeman and a married man, but that didn't seem to stop her, and when John Maguire goes back out in the bush, he has to tell Ben Hall his bad news, and that would have gone down like a lead balloon. Now when Ben Hall gets back here, you know, he's obviously pretty devastated, according to John Maguire, but not for too long, because within 6 months he's got a relationship with a lady by the name of Susan Pryor. So heartbroken, but not for too long. Now, where was Ben Hall's place? William Hollister. He was a policeman, and he kept a very neat little diary during this period, and he comes past here a number of times. Now, he says that when he comes past here, he goes past Weaga Homestead, which is just past that ridge and next to that tree line. There used to be a track that ran down through there, past John Maguire's place and on to Ben Hall's paddock where Ben Hall lived. So he's telling us that he's not on his 40 acres, in actual fact, he's some distance away. Inspector Sanderson, he's in pursuit of the Bushranger of the Elmgar robbery, and he comes looking for Hall. In actual fact, he arrests Hall and William Hall and Dan Charters at his place, then comes down and he says he has to come down some distance to pick up John Maguire. So he's telling us they're not at the same location either. So how else do we know where Ben Hall's place was? Well, there was a case where Inspector Norton and his Aboriginal tracker, Billy Dargan, comes through here, and again they go past Weago Homestead, past now John Wilson's place, and then on to Ben Hall's paddock. So where was that? He's implying it's still a distance away. So everybody's telling us they didn't cohabitate very closely. Now, the other piece of evidence, and that is the real gem, is that the locals around here know where Ben Hall had his stockyards, and they're just the other side of that ridge. And when you think about it logically, Ben Hall wouldn't have built his homestead too far away from those stockyards, so we're going to go and have a look and see if we can find it. In trying to establish where Ben Hall's homestead really was, there's been a lot of conjecture over the years. John Maguire says Ben Hall lived about a mile from his place. And if we know that John Maguire lived just beyond that ridge, which is not quite a mile. Inspector Sanderson, in pursuit of the Bushrangers after the Yongal robbery, says that Ben Hall and John Maguire's huts were about 300 or 400 yards apart. It's a bit further than 300 or 400 yards. But the piece of evidence that's really interesting is the Butlers were here in the late 1800s, and they got to know old Dan Charters, who was arrested with Ben Hall and William Hall right here, he says, at Ben Hall's house. So this places this location as Ben Hall's hut. The other piece of evidence, it's widely believed and known that Ben Hall's stockyards were down there, just beyond that contour bank, near that cattle. So why would Ben Hall have his hut anywhere else than close by? There's a letter written by Veracity, it's a fictitious person, that says that when Pottinger and Hollister and the group of troopers that burnt Ben Hall's hut down, they took all the furniture out of the hut, threw it under the trees and evicted all the people, which was Susan Pryor, Ellen Maguire, William Hall and his wife and their children. So you would expect to find something under these trees. And that's exactly what we did. We found some glass, but what we did find was some bed rails, some bed head knobs, and some components of a stove, which matches up perfectly with that story. So the story about them being evicted and their furniture being thrown under the trees is true. And they would have lived under those iron barks until they moved on. So this, we believe, is most probably the site where Ben Hall had his hut. Ben Hall's first run-in with the law was in April of 1862, and it would be known as a Bacon Dray affair. The story goes like this. There were 3 drays making their way from Forbes to Young. They were led by a man by the name of Bacon. The second one was a guy by the name of Horsnail, third is Ferguson. About 10 miles from Forbes, they're bailed up by a group of men, and they think the leader was Frank Gardner. They're not sure, but they think so. But they do recognise 2 men, Hall and Youngman. Now Youngman used to work as a stockman for Hall on his station right here. Now Pottinger and Mitchell will go to the Forbes races and arrest Hall and Youngman and take them to Forbes for a preliminary hearing. Now Mitchell will take down Horsnail's and Bacon's testimony, and they say they recognise Hall and Youngman from drinking with them at the hotel in Forbes, or several hotels in Forbes. But they also say that Hall would get off his horse and go across to the dray and take off some gin and bits and pieces and throw it on Gardner's pack horse. But in all of this time, they never mentioned the fact that Hall has got a limp. But that doesn't save them. Hall and Youngman were sent off to Orange to stand trial. But Horsnail doesn't turn up. The police are forced to use the other teamster, Ferguson. And when he gets in the witness box, he surprises everybody because he looks at Hall and says, "I do not recognise that man. He was not at the robbery." And to everybody's amazement, Hall is set free. but Youngman will be committed to stand trial. Maguire foolishly then goes as bondsman and puts up the money so Youngman can go free. But Youngman never goes to trial, he absconds. And that casts a huge suspicion over Maguire and Hall and if they had tampered with the witnesses. But Mitchell, the guy who took down the testimony from Bacon and from Horsnail, to his dying days believes that those witnesses were tampered with. Gardner, in his version of events, says that whilst he was holding up the drays, Hall and Youngman simply went past, and that is what Hall also will state, that he just went past during the robbery. A few weeks after Ben Hall was released from the Bacon Dray affair in Orange, a robbery will take place here at Escort Rock. It's probably the largest gold robbery in Australian history, and history will say there were 8 bushrangers that took part in this robbery. Now, they will say that Ben Hall was one of those men, but was Ben Hall really here? Now, the only evidence we have is that Dan Charters, when he gets caught at Ben Hall's place, along with his brother William Hall, will turn Queen's evidence. Ben Hall and William Hall will be released about 4 weeks after they're arrested with not enough evidence. But Charters rolls over and he becomes Queen's evidence, and he names the men that were part of this robbery. He says there was Gardner and Gilbert, and then the police are not surprised. There was a guy by the name of Alex Fordyce, and they go and arrest him. They mention a guy by the name of John Bower or John Bow, they go and arrest him. And he says, well, I was there, that's 5, that's Dan Charters, and he names 3 other men, a Harry, Billy and a Charlie, and the police will catch up with Harry, who turns out to be Henry Manns. But history says the other 2 men who are never actually captured or accounted for will be John O'Malley and Ben Hall. That's Billy and Charlie. So that is the summation of the Bushrangers and who was here. Now, when Dan Charters goes to Sydney, along with the rest of them, there's another man who's Queen's evidence, and that's a guy by the name of Richardson. And he owns a lemonade stand in Forbes, but he also works for John Maguire. And when they get him, he says that while he was working for John Maguire, he saw a number of men coming and going from his place, and he thinks that the planning took place at John Maguire's residence. So he is rounded up and sent off to Sydney as well. Now, the reason the police are also probably pretty interested in John Maguire is they are suspicious about whether he tampered with those witnesses in the Bacon Dray affair. So he's off to Sydney just to cool off anything. So when they get to Sydney, all these men are under oath and nobody says, oh yeah, by the way, you know, Ben Hall was there. Even when Charters is challenged and said, was Ben Hall at the robbery? He says, I know who Ben Hall is, and he was not there. So he categorically denies that Ben Hall was involved. None of the other men under oath will mention Ben Hall's name. Now, how else do we work out who's at the robbery? Well, it turns out John O'Malley was here because John Vane, in his memoirs, runs into Frank Gardner when they catch up with Frank Gardner many years later, and Frank Gardner recounts that it was himself, John Gilbert, Fordyce, Bower or Bow, and Charters. So he's mentioned those 5 men. Doesn't know who Harry, Billy and Charlie is, but even though Henry Manns has been hanged, this Billy and Charlie is missing. But he does mention John O'Malley and explains what happens to his gold, or what Gardner thinks happened to his gold. So O'Malley has been named here by Gardner, but Gardner, in his recount to Vane, doesn't mention Hall either. So, and that's after Hall has been shot and killed. So there's no reason to protect him, but he doesn't mention him. Last piece of information that's of interest, there's a young fella by the name of Burgess. Now he's a young teenager at the time, and he and his father are bringing some drays down from Orange. They're approaching from the north, and when they get within a few 100 yards of the place, Gardner and the gang round them up and pull their hats over their heads, tape them back, and hold them over against the trees. Now, this young fella says that he could actually see through a hole in his hat, and he could see what happened here at the Escort Rock. And he says behind this rock were 7 bushrangers, and that matches up to the story. But he doesn't mention anybody with a limp. So you would think if Ben Hall was here and all this running around carrying gold and doing all the stuff they were doing, this man with a limp would have sort of come up. but it doesn't. And the reason being is Gardner is very, very astute, because Maguire has only got one eye, remember? And if he wasn't included, because Gardner only wanted able-bodied men he could count on. And so Maguire, he was used as a planning place, but was not included in the robbery. And it makes you think that Gardner may have done the same thing about Hall. He may not have included him because he had this limp, and he just couldn't count on him. So again, nobody has named Hall at the robbery. This is the site of the old Pinnacle Police Barracks, and here is the remnants of the chimney of that site. Now, why did the police put the barracks here in the first place? Well, there was an inn down the road called the Pinnacle Inn, and the police were suspicious that there were sympathisers to Bushrangers, and the Bushrangers were visiting there. And typical of the time, if they had any suspicions about people in the district or of the area, they would just plonk some barracks right in the middle of it. And this is one of those occasions. Now, on the 7th of February 1863, there's a Constable Knox, Hollister and an Aboriginal tracker by the name of Dargan. They're stationed here. Now, Hollister and Dargan are going to go into Forbes for the day, leaving Knox in charge of the barracks. Now, he says in his story that at 6 AM he locks the barracks up, it's secured, and he goes down to Pinnacle Inn for breakfast. And he's there until 9 AM, a 3-hour breakfast. Not bad being a policeman, is it? And when he comes back, the place has been ransacked. He's missing a saddle, some bridles, some ammunition and a carbine rifle. Now he gets on his horse and he gallops off towards Forbes to get help, and meets Hollister and Dargan on the way back, and they all come back here, scout around, have a look around, and they find two tracks leading away towards Pinnacle Reef. So Hollister and Dargan go tracking them. Now they do catch up with two horsemen in the distance, so they decide to give chase, but in doing so, Hollister's horse rears up, throws him off, and he's flat on his back. But Dargan takes off after these two guys on horses. And when they see these two troopers coming after them, they take off as well. Now Dargan says he was gaining on them, but as he got closer towards them, one of them turns around in the saddle and fires a revolver at him. So Dargan, who had a reputation for not being the bravest police tracker in the police force, breaks chase and goes back to find Hollister on his back. But he says, from the distance, with two men galloping away from him, all he can see is their behinds, he recognised them as Patsy Daly and Ben Hall. So that is what implicates Ben Hall at the robbery at the Pinnacle Police Station. On the 1st of March 1863, Ben Hall will get into an altercation with Sub-Inspector Norton. And it's a very serious affair, and it's probably one of Ben Hall's worst decisions. The story goes a bit like this. Norton and Dargan are on a patrol. They've come in via the Wet Mountains. They say they go past Wiego, they go past Wilson's, and they're about 500 yards past Wilson's, which is about here, where they see two horsemen, O'Mealy and Daly, and they go after them. And it's not very long, and there's an exchange of gunfire, and they break chase, and those two men disappear into the bush. Dargan will continue to go on. Norton will stay here at Ben Hall's homestead. Dargan's just down the paddock there, and he's about 500 yards away, and he sees Ben Hall, and he chases Ben Hall into the corner of his paddock. But Norton orders Dargan to come back, as he wants to go for assistance because they're outgunned. As they're making their way back to the Pinnacle Police Station through the wetlands, Hall, O'Malley and Daly will run them down and capture Sub-Inspector Norton. Dargan gets away, and O'Malley and Daly go after him, and they track him all the way back down to the Pinnacle for about an hour and a half. They capture him and bring him back here. But Norton is held captive by Ben Hall for about 3 hours. Now, Hall will make a couple of really strong points to Norton. He says, "You've got my brother-in-law, Johnny the Warrior Walsh, in the logs in Forbes. He's very unwell and he wants him let out." In actual fact, Johnny Walsh will actually pass away about a month after this event. The other thing Hall is trying to push back, he said he's tired of being hounded by Pottinger. You see, Pottinger's already arrested him and he's been acquitted of the Bacon Dray affair. He was also, a month later, arrested being involved in Irongale robbery and was again let out because no one could identify Hall as being there. And so he's trying to push back, he's trying to get across to Norton that he's sick and tired of being hounded. Interesting that Hall didn't even know who Sub-Inspector Norton was. He actually thought it was William Hollister, and he knew Hollister hated him and he wanted to have a go at him, but he did not even know what Hollister looked like either. The other thing is, Norton didn't even know who Hall was. It was Billy Dargan who identified Hall and was the only one that could. So Norton was out here and he had no idea what he was looking for. But they will be set free and Norton and Dargan will make their way back to Forbes. But the police are really, really angry, in fact, that one of their own had been captured. 2 weeks later, on the 14th of March, Frederick Pottinger, Hollister and a group of troopers will turn up just down there and they'll burn Ben Hall's house to the ground. Now, Susan Pryor and Ellen Maguire are here along with his brother and sister-in-law. On the 18th of March, 4 days later, Hollister's back here looking for Hall, and he tracks Hall and Ellen Maguire, he says, through the Wedding Mountains and back to Wiago where Ellen Maguire is left and Ben Hall disappears. So Hollister is on Ben Hall's trail. But this is where that Norton affair took place, just down in that gully. What was it that made Ben Hall become that bushranger that history has portrayed? Some will say that it was a breakdown of his relationship with Bridget, and the fact that she ran off with a married man, an ex-policeman, and took his son Henry, and that his life simply descended into a life of crime. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because within about 6 months he's in a relationship with Susan Pryor, which will result in a young daughter called Mary, who was born in the latter part of January of 1863. So it doesn't seem to indicate that Ben Hall became the victim to that circumstance. So was Ben Hall really that bushranger all the time? While he was working here at Sandy Creek, did he wander off and commit a number of crimes? Well, he's certainly implicated, that's for sure, but he was found not guilty of a couple, and others, there was no real evidence to support that Hall was there. And no one has ever said, prior to the end of 1863, that Ben Hall walked up to them, pointed a revolver in their face and asked for him. So, and it's the Sub-Inspector Norton, which is right at the end of the story, in March of 1863, where after Dargan, in this very paddock, chases him down the paddock, shooting at Hall, that Hall turns around and chases him back and captures him and Norton, and holds Norton captive for 3 hours, and all he does is say, "You've got to let my brother-in-law Johnny the Warrior Walsh out of the logs in Forbes, he's going to die, and tell Pottinger to bugger off and leave me alone." He gives Norton back his revolver and says, "Here, that's no good to me, you can have that back." And when Norton goes back to Forbes, he says that, Hall was very cordial, very polite, and had a reasonable conversation with him. So it seems like Hall was just frustrated and just pointing a gun at the man and saying, am I getting my point across? So it doesn't seem to us that Ben Hall really was that renowned bushranger yet. And the other thing that really is quite interesting is Ben Hall is never found involved in cattle duffing. Now, you've got over 20,000 acres here, and it was a pretty rife sort of a crime amongst property owners, no matter about bushrangers, and not once does it turn up in a police gazette. Ben Hall is being suspected of duffing cattle. And of all the crimes of bushrangering he would want to commit, that would be the best one. It doesn't turn up. Not that we can find yet anyway. So it doesn't appear really that Ben Hall had started becoming this bushranger. Was he pushing back against that oppression from the people by this authority on the people of the Weddin Mountains? I think there's a bit of that going on, because his hut here is burnt down in 1863 in March. Now, remembering Wilson, who lives just over there, had ordered the police, asked the police to do it. If they didn't do it, he would, because there were people living in there. And I want to make this completely clear, that Wilson and Pottinger, the police, were within their rights to evict those people out of that hut. Burning it down, maybe not, but they were on Wilson's side of the lease. They were not on Ben Hall's side of the lease. So I want that to be perfectly clear. Pottinger was acting mostly within the letter of the law. And that has always been a point of contention throughout history. Then Warrigal Walsh dies. So, Hall must be thinking to himself, geez, is this ever going to end? And then, Mally's place is burnt down at Aragon in September of 1863. So he must be really starting to think, is there no end to what these people will do to us? And then it's after that you see the emergence of that man who is now going to confront the police, and he becomes brazen in his crimes, and that's where that legend begins. I think Maguire probably has got somewhere near the truth. He says that Hall received evil counsel from Frank Gardner. Now, whether this counsel actually took place, I think is irrelevant, because I think what Maguire is telling us is very accurate, or very close to what happened. In that counsel, Gardner says to Hall, that bacon dray affair, it wasn't your innocence that kept you out of jail, it was Maguire's money. So they're implying that Hall was actually innocent of that crime. He wasn't there, wasn't involved, but it took Maguire's money to make the change. He says to him, Gardner says to Hall, it doesn't matter how innocent a man is of the crime, there is no bar for you going to prison for it. He says the only solution Hall has is to confront the police with a stout resistance and good firearms. Now, Maguire calls that evil counsel, and for good reason. It's probably not good advice. But Hall sees himself with no option. He sees it like that. And that is what Hall decides to do. And I think that is how come Ben Hall finished up taking the path of crime that he did.